Welcome to Daimonosophy, and my guest this evening is again the great Stephen E. Flowers, here to talk to us about his new book, The Occult Roots of Bolshevism, From Cosmist Philosophy to Magical Marxism. Welcome, Dr. Flowers.
Well, I'm glad to be here. It's a great place you have.
Well, it's great to have you back. I always appreciate you coming to visit and sharing your insights and wisdom with us here. Tell us about the new book. Tell us about The Occult Roots of Bolshevism.
Well, it's one of those things where it's a subject that hasn't ever been really exploited, as far as research is concerned, at a popular level, certainly, and taking this particular look at it is something new, because people think, well, how could there possibly be the communism, Bolshevism is totally materialistic, and that has nothing to do with occultism. And of course that stems from the fact that people don't really have a solid idea of the definition of occultism being concepts, ideas applied that are either kinds of knowledge that has been superseded and is now no longer a part of the establishment, such as how astronomy and astrology and that sort of thing, or are ideas that are speculative and just not established as something someone believes in, or is not a part of consensus reality. And we see that Russian cosmism in the 19th century and early 20th century played a part in the Russian underground, if you will, and then Marx himself held ideas that are only logical, scientific, and reasonable because they are asserted to be so, but not because they actually are so in any way. It's rather like Christians saying, well, it's obvious that the Bible is true or whatever. They just assert its truth, but there's no overt or concrete evidence to make that knowledge as concrete as they would have you believe. And certainly Marxism falls into that category. And so from all of these different angles, I started to look at Bolshevism, Russian culture, as an application of Marxist ideas, as well as the cosmist underground that was much more influential on the Bolsheviks than most people realize. There was one person named Alexander Bogdanov who was actually the rival of Lenin for leadership of the party, and he was a cosmist and wrote a science fiction novel called Red Star in 1905. And it's about a Russian revolutionary who's taken to Mars, and there he's shown the perfect society according to communist principles, etc. And then this character returns to Earth and tries to implement these ideas on Earth. And so it's a science fiction sort of utopian kind of novel, but in 1905 it was so popular that Red Star, of course, becomes the emblem of the Red Army and of the whole movement, and it was because of the romantic adherence to these ideas of this science fiction novel that was the power behind that image. And so this guy, he was a cosmist. He believed in which basically, let's say, what cosmism, there were numerous thinkers in Russia who, led by Fyodorov and Nikolai Fyodorov, And he was a man who believed in the idea that human beings, as we live, our bodies today can be made immortal. And actually, science will be able to resurrect the dead and make them immortal. And other cosmists forwarded the idea of space travel, because see, if you make everyone immortal, and everyone who ever lived immortal, the planet's going to be too crowded. So, therefore, we need to go into outer space and colonize other planets, you see. And the Russians were into this sort of thing already in the 19th century. And so these ideas of actually making man immortal and colonizing space and such things were a part of the cosmist movement. And the Bolsheviks were also attached to this idea, so much so that their space program was totally fixated on going to Mars. And it wasn't until 1964, thereabouts, that they decided to change their objective and get into the race for the moon with the Americans. But they had lost so much time with this impossible task that that was one of their hundreds of fatal errors that made them fail at what they were trying to do. And so all of these ideas play a part in the occult world of this Russian Bolshevik Russian kind of subculture that became the establishment, of course, there.
So I have a question for you in that comes out of that, specifically as it pertains to cosmism and like Fedorov's idea that, you know, the common task, that everyone can eventually be resurrected. What would you say to someone, because this is what I found when I talk about these ideas or people are exposed to this idea, sometimes people are like drawn into that. They're like, that's awesome. They like that. Like that's kind of it kind of resonates as a pathway towards immortality. Do you think that like some of those futurist ideas, does that have relevance for someone who's, say, pursuing individual personal, you know, immortality through, you know, whatever, left-hand path initiation? Is that relevant, or is it something that's really tied in with this sort of collectivist thing that leads to, you know, Bolshevism and, you know, all of that piece of it? Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I don't know how, since people like Fyodorov were really religious people, Orthodox religion, you know, as far as Russian Orthodoxy, that was as Christian to them, it was a Christian thing. But see, we know that the Bolsheviks, the actual party members, this atheism and things like that were merely a tool, like so many things that a big government anywhere does, is they have, you know, rules for thee but not for me. We're kind of used to that around here. And, you know, and it was the same thing. I mean, just like how did Putin just all of a sudden become an Orthodox adherent after being brought up in the Soviet system and being a KGB officer and all that kind of a thing? You'd think he would have been, he was never exposed to that, someone might say, but that's not true. I mean, it was a secret teaching, if you will, behind the scenes in the new aristocracy, which was the Communist Party, but they used these ideas as just another tool to bludgeon the people with, and they weren't really required, except, of course, if someone like Stalin would just say, well, I don't like you, and I saw you praying the other day, so I think you need to be liquidated. You know, he could use it as an excuse at any time, just like anything else in these kind of systems. But it really, I remember seeing, I think it was Chernenko, one of those last leaders of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, had his funeral. I was watching it live or whatever back in the 80s or whenever it was, and his widow was bending over his open casket, and she had some kind of cross in her hand, and she was making all kinds of religious gesticulations and such, these Orthodox prayers and such. And I thought, wait a minute, this doesn't compute in my mind, right? That these people have had 70 years of atheism, and these are the leaders. These people should believe that. And I realized and later learned, of course, that, again, those rules don't apply to them.
Mm-hmm.
They did what they wanted, and except insofar, again, if you were just disliked by someone with power, then that might be used like anything else might be used against you. I saw in writing the book, I saw time after time these people who did great things for the country, for the party, for the regime, would run afoul for whatever reason of the higher-ups, and they would be sent to the gulag, or they would be executed. Even people who were high-up KGB, NKVD, officers, etc. It didn't matter. If you ran afoul, that was it.
Yeah.
And by the same token, people could ruin everything, and still, he's the greatest guy in the world. He's just wonderful, and is just causing disaster right and left. But he's well liked by by Stalin or whoever, so he can do no wrong.
Yeah. So you also talk about the theories of Lysenko.
Yeah,
and he had an impact on destroying agriculture.
Yeah, but he came up with a theory, or he espoused a theory of botany, of plant rearing and so forth and so on, of the wheat crop, that brought into the theory the idea of class and the dialectic, the historical dialectic. He made he politicized the wheat plant and created a fairy tale for that. And Stalin really liked that. He thought that was great. So he put him in charge of everything having to do with the wheat crop, and he went for decades ruining it with these crazy theories. But because the theory was very favorable to the political powers that be, it was to their taste and to their liking, then he remained in power throughout and was never ostracized, except when he died. He was hardly noticed because people knew what he had done, But harm, I realized when watching these things, or reading these things, the people that these political operatives propose to be helping and be their clients, if you will, the people they're fighting for, are the ones that suffer the most, because they're just going to take it. As long as the leader says, I hate who you hate, then that leader can do no wrong, as long as he's hurting the aristocracy or in the beginning, or the capitalists or the Jews or whatever it was that the people didn't particularly like. As long as he's acting against the people I don't like, then I like him. He's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
but then,
that's what's
then he never pays the price, though. Like whenever whenever there is this devastation or the result of war or whatever, it's like
who gets hurt? It's just peasants and workers getting hurt.
Yeah.
They can take it. We don't care about that. They're our pawns,
Right.
They can get hurt and keep hurting, and they'll never rebel against us because we've got their number. So, yeah. But how much of what we see in studying the Soviet Union and the whole movement are Nazis the same way, just how they maintained control, through means that are not foreign to things that we see in our own country. It's just a lighter, gentler form, if you will.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about like Marxist occultism and the mystical ideas being called scientific? Like what sorts of things do they do?
If we have the basic cosmology of Marxism, for example, Marx was a philosopher. He's a doctor of philosophy. He wrote his dissertation on the Epicureans, who were the ancient Greek materialists who gave us the atomic theory, the idea that they believed that everything was made up of little particles so small we can't divide them. That's what atomos means, indivisible particles. And, of course, what evidence did they have for this? Nothing. It was just an idea, a speculation. Now, in that case, it had a grain of truth to it, obviously, but that was not based on any evidence. It was just Greek thinkers sitting around pondering things and imagining, what if this? And sometimes that's like it is with occult ideas. That is hidden. Who the average Greek? What? Everything is made up of little things, and the gods too are made up of these, and they will die, and all these are crazy ideas that you have here, as the average Greek of over 2,000 years ago would have thought. And Marx was fascinated by this, of course. That is materialism. This was pure materialism. There is no spiritual world. Everything is atoms, some closer together than others, and so they seem to be immaterial, but they're gaseous instead of solid, that sort of thing. Now, so he believed that with good reason, since atomic theory starts to be shown to have some basis in hard science as time goes on. But at the same time, he adopted other ideas, such as from Hegel, the idea of the dialectic. Hegel is not a materialist, but that's the thing. He put these ideas with a materialism, and you say, well, now we have a material dialectic, a historical dialectic, and that there is this a plan, or there's actually not a plan, because that implies a planner, rather a history, and the world is a kind of an organism that has a beginning, and then it grows and it evolves through a dialectic, through a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, going through time. And now this is all, people are nodding their head going, yeah, that sounds like, well, there's no basis for this idea scientifically. It's just a useful idea. Marx was a brilliant student in school of Christianity, which is the religion he was brought up in, and so he was influenced by that, obviously, also. So you see that if you look at Marxism as a historical developmental model, it's basically the same as you find in Christianity. That is, there was a time in the past in which there was no private property. Everything was held in common, and it was a communist paradise. And then there came what was the equivalent of original sin, which was the idea of private property. And then there was a inevitable evolution historically in an organic kind of model by which we go from a slave state to a feudal state to a capitalist state, And then inevitably there will be a socialist state because capitalism will collapse of its own weight, is his theory. And then there will be a communist coming of communism, but it really requires someone to understand and for it to be revealed to you this truth that I have just told you, and that is Karl Marx himself. He comes, and he is the equivalent of a Christ figure who comes and gives the good news of the historical dialectic, of the revolution, etc., and he reveals it to the unwashed masses so that they can act on this in revolution. And at that point, then, the revolution will begin, and there will be this millennial time period, dictatorship of the proletariat and all of that. And so then, therefore, a new world of communist utopia will be instituted. Back in the days when I was in the 60s and early 70s and so forth, tooling around and thinking about these sorts of things, somebody would say to somebody from Hungary or Poland or wherever, you in the communist countries, oh, this is not a communist country. That is for the future. We are a socialist state, but communism is the end. That's when everything, again, the state withers away, and there is all property is held in common, and all people are equal. Now, all of that, you see, is mystical as any other millennialist kind of cult of the Middle Ages or whatever. It's all the same kind of mythology. The difference, of course, is that the Bolshevik knows it's a lie. Mm-hmm. You can tell that historically because when the racket was no longer as profitable as it probably could have been, they just gave it up. Right? Mm-hmm. They didn't really believe it any more than Chernenko's widow believed in Bolshevism when she was praying her mm-hmm. Orthodox prayers. They knew this is a magical tool to use against our enemies and most especially against our friends. Mm-hmm. The people who love us and who are loyal to us, they'll take anything. And so we can exploit mm-hmm. them just like what's going on now. Their way of fighting, on the Russian front and the Germans versus the Russians, the Germans were killing them 10-1, but we got 20. Mm-hmm. I don't care, Right. And so that's the same thing. That's sort of a Marxist. They have certain calculations, like how many of when a revolution comes, what percentage of the population do you need to get rid of, mm-hmm. In order to make the transition smoother? Because if you just let everyone continue, they're going to cause friction. So you need to get rid of, whether it was in Russia, whether it was in China, wherever it's part of the, part of the formula. So that's but again, we're thinking, oh no, this all sounds like it's someone might fall into the trap of thinking that all sounds very reasonable, but really it's just as mad as any cult you'll ever find. It's just that mm-hmm. people did it, and to a certain extent were successful for a while, but of course we see that because it was unreasonable and typical of a kind of a cult mentality, projected into a collective reality where these ideas are really not correct or not very beneficial. There are more things, cult ideas can be useful to individuals, but when you try to apply it over an entire society, first coercion and force have to be used to make it happen, and second of all, because it is not really reasonable or very healthy thing for people's lives, it will inevitably, I suppose, history seems to show, end in failure. And the Russians, certainly demonstrated that, except, of course, a very cynical person might point out that, well, all they did was change their racket, from being a Bolshevik to being a Russian nationalist kind of model. But I would again point out, if you look at Russian history of the present moment, it's the world's largest country, incredible amounts of incredible human resources, brilliant people, great ability. Everything's, what I would say, is just entirely squandered.
Mm-hmm.
Just waste everywhere. Could be great, but is not, because doesn't have a beneficial model for government. So
right.
So that's
it's a great example of how coercion, just in principle, just has a destructive influence, even if it was the best intentions. Yeah, again, I think a lot of what you're uncovering here is that quite often there's really not the best intentions underneath it. Underneath it all is really the same selfish and destructive intentions that we find all the time.
Right.
And another thing that you brought up.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say another thing that you had brought up is in this book is this idea of red magic, which I found just incredibly interesting. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Right. Well, if you red magic hinges on some of the same ideas that you find in medieval Christianity, but where in any event, just mechanically, where a person will claim to be defending or being the agent for some downtrodden or person or group of people who are in need of your help, you see, who can't survive without you. That says, well, you can't make it, but I will come here and I will lead this revolution. I will do these things, and I will then make you whole. I will fix it for you, since you can't do it yourself. Then that's what the revolution comes to. All these aristocrats and capitalists are exploiting you, so we're going to have this revolution, and we're going to turn this over to you, to the people. But of course, it's just a mechanism for that agent, the apparatchik, to gain all of the power, because they are gangsters. And of course, the ancient Romans, the philosophers, Porphyry and others, look at early Christians and said, these are a gang. This is a criminal gang. They are foreigners. They are slaves, a lot of them, but they worship an executed criminal. They meet in graveyards. They're bent on taking over the empire by hook or crook. And they were right, weren't they? But that was the idea, that they were there. But see, the Christians were saying, oh no, we're here to help the downtrodden, the masses, etc. Of course, look at the Middle Ages. When they get control, you think the peasants were any better off, or anybody was any better off? No. That wasn't the point. It was to get and keep power for the gang. And any gangster would sit there and go, well, like Stalin was a bank robber. He was what he was. That was his specialty. He robbed things. He was a muscle man. And Lenin didn't want him to take over, and it was like he couldn't communicate at the end there to say, no, not Stalin, anybody but him. But it didn't work. But the point was that, you see, a gang might say, well, we're going to take this turf, we're going to take this territory to do our deal, to our whatever our racket is, and we're going to have the east side, and you take that. Wait a minute, these people pause and say, no, let's take the whole thing. the whole country and everything in it, every means of production, every piece of property, and the people that live in it will become our property. Now, that sounds a whole lot like the aristocracy of the Middle Ages, and that's all that really the Bolsheviks were, a new aristocracy, that were a member of this self-selected group. So in that regard, that's the practice of this red magic, where you use not just pure brute force. That's why it's magic and not just military conquest. You have to win over the hearts and minds of the people and make the masses believe that you are working for them and that they need you. You see, and so it's a mind-altering, a mind-changing technology. And you see that Hitler used the same kind of thing. Just in a way, Hitler used a way that was more understandable, because he used these external symbols so brilliantly, the uniforms, the rituals of this, that, whereas the Bolsheviks were really more subtle than that, really. They probably had less to work, that they had to win over, being basically a medieval state they were working with, whereas Germany was one of the most modern countries in the world, if not the most. So it was a different kind of field of operation where these two things were at work. But that's the essence of red magic. There's people, even in an office place, and you say, well, I'm going to get the reputation for being, for the little guy and help him, but just any kind of way to make yourself look good and use it as leverage to get power over others, and then get into position to get power, and then of course keep it through exaggerated claims of your moral superiority or whatever.
So do you think it's a good way to try and achieve power, or is it because and maybe this is the situation with the Bolsheviks in reality, is that when you gain power based upon illusions and lies, well, you end up you have to support all of those illusions and lies. You have to use all of your energy and resources to support all those illusions and lies, and you're always worried. As an individual, you always have that in your mind. You always have that, what if they find me out?
Right, and they're going to find you out because the things you're claiming you're going to fix, you can't fix. Because really, you're not spending any of your resources, intellectual resources, into making things work, because you got it easy. If it doesn't work, we'll just blame somebody else. If the crops don't come in, it's because of those, saboteurs, capitalists, America, whatever, foreign saboteurs are causing all this to go wrong, and that's what's going on. It's just like in the Middle Ages. Why won't the cow dried up? It must be a witch, Just it's kind of odd. It's like there were occult connections to some of these Bolsheviks. And Lenin, his grandmother had been executed, as I recall, as a witch. And Stalin supposedly had a woman. I have a picture of her in the book, who was his spiritual advisor, and it was pointed out that almost no pictures of Stalin are genuine. Even the guy who stood up on Lenin's tomb at the May Day thing was generally a double, and not the actual Stalin. And that was because he was afraid of of curses and things like that. He was a Georgian, just a guy from Georgia. And so, all these kind of things were common enough, I guess, but there was these kind of things were going on. But it's under the good government are good. You have to, but to do the right thing, you have to be successful. You have to have it's a higher, much more complicated form of magic initiation to make something work well, and as opposed to just saying, well, all we got to do is just convince them. Just that what they think is true is not true, and that someone else is to blame. That's the one. If we just have that trick in our, toolbox, we can make it. It'll be okay. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, like I pointed out, this like when you're in Russia or Moscow, in 1965 or whatever, if you saw an automobile driving down the road, you knew that was a party guy in that thing. It wasn't no common people had automobiles, right? And so you see a convoy of cars coming into town. That was all just just like in the Middle Ages with the Tsar and his, people. It was the same thing. It was just substituting one aristocracy for the other, and the people don't see that. They think, oh, they're our heroes.
Yeah.
Because that's the one trick they learned, how to make them believe this lie.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's really sad. And one thing that I really enjoyed in this book, I thought was really delightful, is your discussion about your days as an anti-communist freedom fighter.
Yeah,
and that's where you got the
hyperbole there. Well, yeah, I had the opportunity. I was fantasized when I was in high school. It was the days of the Czech, the Prague Spring, where the Czechs were kind of revolting in '68, and I was just starting high school or something about then. And it was all very romanticized in my mind, all that world. And so when I was over there, after I graduated high school, a guy was a friend of mine there at the German language school. And he was from Hungary, and what had happened to him, see, he had escaped from Hungary. This was 1971, and he was forbidden from studying medicine because his mother was an ethnic German, and they had ethnic sort of policies because the Germans had German-speaking people, and when I say German, I don't mean a German person from the state of Germany, but just a German language person, Austrian, whatever. Of course, had ruled Hungary mainly, and so they were trying to set the, affirmative action, if you will. So, only pure Hungarians, will get preference for these plum positions at the medical school. So he couldn't study, so he escaped. And he had a whole bunch of friends who were also trying to escape, and so they needed information. Of course, you couldn't write. They opened all the letters. They didn't, there was no sneaking around. They just opened the letter and sent them in packages. It was like nothing. You cannot communicate with anybody there, either by writing or telephone. And so they had to have couriers go in to communicate vital information to these people who are trying to escape. And so I volunteered to do this as an 18-year-old idiot. Okay, 18-year-olds will do anything. Vietnam was full of them. And so here I am. I go there and get the message out to them. Now, I went to a town south of Budapest where tourists weren't supposed to be. You have this sort of thing where you can only go to these certain places. But I just bought a ticket and went. And so I was hanging out there for a couple of days, and then one morning in this place where I was staying, knock, the proverbial knock, before sunup comes at the door. Bang, bang, bang. Okay. And I had to go down to the police station. And that was, this guy's father went, but he was a physician and so forth. That's probably what really helped me. That he was well connected. But here it's just like this building, this gray building with this giant red star on the top of it. Here you go in there. And they just kind of gave me the once over, looked at my, and said, you need to have 24 hours or 12 hours or whatever it was to get out of this country, So I just left, I just took off got in the train and went. But then, of course, the whole story, you have to read it in the book. It's too long, really, to go into the whole thing here. But, when I was just about to cross the border back into Austria, they took me off the train and took me over into this little building. And it was in there, and the train went off and left me. And it was dark, and there I was with all these guys with whatever kind of machine guns they had, standing there at the door. And, then they started interrogating me. But luckily, I had been told by my friend that, since they won't use any rubber hoses or strip search or do all the things they do to us, because you're an American, they won't do that. But I was glad it was true. And but they would ask me, do you have, and then, so they just kind of said, okay, get back to this little doodlebug train comes back over the border and is sitting there. And then, I think you can go, going over there and getting that car, then that train, and you'll be on your way. And so I go in there, and I sit down at the back of it, and then through the front door of this car, the guy comes in. And he's dressed like an Austrian. He's a little guy, but he looks like a gnome or something. He's got the whole Austrian lederhose, the whole thing. This was like he was from the Hofbräu house or something. And he goes, he said, what's happened? I said, well, they were, detaining me, and so we're speaking German to it. But, they were detaining me, because they thought I had something. Well, I bet you really got away with it, didn't you? Yeah, I bet you fooled them. Well, what'd you have, really, I said, I didn't have anything. I did have something else stuck in my pants. I did have the message. But, and so then he just kind of, was trying to do that. And then he said, okay, then he left, went out the front door. And then I was looking out the window, and there he got off the train and went over to that guardhouse, where I had been held. He was just a guy, it was just their last ditch thing,
Yeah.
But so I was lucky, to never have said the wrong thing.
Yeah.
So.
No, you could have ended up in a gulag at a very early age, and you never would have even gotten to write this book.
Yeah, or I'd have had a better one to write. Oh boy, and the scars to prove it. But that's the kind of stuff. I mean, that's I'm not saying that was anything great, but it was for an 18-year-old kid with nothing, just fantasies and dreams in his head. It was a pretty good experience, I guess.
Well, it's also, it's a reminder, maybe for some of us younger folks, that those things are in recent memory in in our world, and this comes back to why I think that this book is so important right now, is because it feels like some of that red magic is coming back, like it's making a comeback somehow.
Well, it's a secularized version, just like a lot of the other things about Marx I was talking about earlier are secularized versions of what the Christians or other cults have practiced in the past. But the magic or the myth that people most readily believe nowadays have to do with money, economics, and material things, materialistic things. Those are the more believable myths rather than angels and sons of Hebrew storm gods come to absolve you of your sins and things like that. So it's the application of a magic, sorcery of that kind on a collective scale requires generally that you tap into a mythology that the masses find appealing. Mm-hmm. And so that's essential to that kind of operation.
You know, it's interesting. The writer Thomas Sowell, he talks about, we were talking about like in modern society, capitalism. There's other ways of finding those evils, like creating those evils versus like angels and demons and stuff. And he talks about how certain ethnic groups who are kind of nomadic or semi-nomadic over time have always been easy targets as like evil capitalist-like influences. And of course, there's the Jews, but there's also, you know, like Vietnamese and lots of other ethnic groups throughout time who have been more mobile. And it's really easy for a local, you know, the local people to say, oh, look, they own why do they own every shop on there? Well, because they're ripping us off and everything. And so it's really easy for political figures to turn people's anger towards, you know, certain outsider groups like that.
Right. Yeah, well, that's very typical. Or if one is savvy enough to have realize or what it is that the people you're trying to manipulate, what they're afraid of, what they believe, all those things, and then you know what. Or that person would know what to say. Like Hitler points out, you know, in Mein Kampf, he says, you know, I wasn't an anti-Semite. I wasn't brought up that way, you know, but I realized that in order to forge a national unity among the German people, that was his chief problem, he thought, you know, you have to have an enemy, you know, someone that you can blame things on, and there was only one people that were for that, and those were the Jews. And at that moment, I became an anti-Semite. So he just comes right out and says, it wasn't really, I mean, but the huge numbers of German people, religious people, or whatever kind of people, you know, different things, were, you know, anti-Semitic. Wasn't all that uncommon. It was quite common, ordinary kind of prejudice that existed. And so, you know, exploit that. So he said, well, I got to exploit that, you know. That's the tool I've got to use. And he took to it quite enthusiastically.
So that's a great, yeah. So that's a great, great segue to start talking about your other great new book that's out, The Occult in National Socialism.